Manbit was behaving with wonderful self-restraint due entirely to the presence of John Crow, who not only talked to her a good deal, but talked to her more than anyone else in the room. After the departure of Mr. Robinson from me little place next door, which was Mrs. Legg's polite name for her Temple of Venus, young Toosey locked and bolted this dubious annex and returned to the main dwelling to help wait on his mistress's guests. All the rooms on the ground floor of his house, the biggest as well as the oldest in paradise, were crowded with people, and it would have been a significant discrimination among the old residents of Glastonbury to note just who were the persons who came. Mother Legg was, as has been remarked, liberal in drinks but stingy in food. Even the drinks, however, were limited to whiskey and gin and to a concoction of the lady's own which she called Bridgewater Punch, among the ingredients of which the particular kind of fiery rum used by sailors is more in evidence. Sam Decker, actuated by what in his single-hearted simplicity he regarded as the proper attitude for a neophyte in sanctity, did his utmost to interest Nell Zoyland and Crummy Gerd in each other's personalities. This would have been most difficult, for Nell's mind was still stunned by the change in him and still preoccupied by the certainty that she was, whatever else said about it, really with child. If Crummy hadn't been such a conceptually good-hearted girl. Crummy caught the secret of her rival's sadness with a psychic penetration almost worthy of her father and laid herself out to be sweet to her. And when Crummy did this, there was few women, as there were certainly no men, who could resist her coaxing ways. Thus Sam's simple mind was eminently gratified, as if he had achieved this consummation by something akin to a miracle, when he saw the two girls seated at last side by side, munching Osborne biscuits and sipping with wry faces the famous Bridgewater Punch, as if they were old friends. Mother Legg herself, too portly to be much service with her great silver trays, soon settled herself comfortably in an arm-chair, opposite both poor Titty, from which position of sovereignty she received such obstinance as her dignity, and, if must be confessed too, her Rabelasian tongue spontaneously exacted. She was a vast, dusky, double-chinned mountain of a woman, with astute little grey eyes. Even that seemed rather to aim at not seeing what she wanted to avoid, than at seeing what she wanted to see. Attracted by both John Crow and Mr. Evans, it was Mother Legg's desire to have both these men at her side. Being the hostess, however, and both these men being occupied with the lady, Mr. Evans with Cordelia and John with Mad Bet, it was some time before Mother Legg attained her wish. But she got it at last, and she got it finally so completely that John was caught on a big footstool between her right elbow and the fire, while Mr. Evan was pilloried on a high back chair on her left hand with his profile to the fire. A fire, and he may be sure that this old sorceress knew this well, is a sure magnet for the magnetism of excitable men, and a sure sedative for the nerves of cantankerous men. And now, with the fire as a second or super female to give her aid, Mother Legg had her own way with her favored guests. All the lights in the reception room of this huge priestess of immorality, hung from the ceiling in the shape of two colossal cut-glass candelabra, burning gas with an enormous figured globes from beneath which hung the heaviest festoons of prismatic pendants that John had ever seen. Squintying cautiously round the room as those moments when his pretentious capturer, who resembled a gigantic Gargamel seeking information from Ponocrates, I don't know what that means, was engaged with Mr. Evans, John took occasion to observe that there was nothing in this high-ceilinged chamber which jarred him upon his nature except the physical contortions of the poor woman opposite him, and as her pain, intensified by her inability to move from where she had been placed, grew upon her. These twitchings under that rug, those spasms around that emaciated face, he did find it hard to bear, though no one else except Crummy, who now and then got up and went across to her, seemed conscious of her sufferings. Sam had left the apartment now, feeling it incumbent upon him to be where he least liked to be, namely among the petite bourgeoisie of the gathering, who were consuming tea and bread and jam at the tables with tablecloths in the other two rooms. The sight of Sam's self-conscious unselfishness would have fretted John's heathen mind as much as the tablecloths would have done in the homely tea drinkers. Here in this great chamber, so brilliantly lit by the flashing candelabra, every person and every object seemed to fall into a delicious harmony. He had drunk enough Bridgewater punch already to be feeling exceptionally serene, and as he watched Nell Zoyland and Crummy, Percy and Blackie, Mr. Wallop and Cordelia, Dave Spear, who to Percy's astonishment had just drifted in, talking to Mad Bet, and Tarb Barter, who was now lost in a deep colloquy with a pretty waitress from the Pilgrimses, the whole scene swam and shimmered before him in an incredible luxury of significance. People and objects, as John now looked at them, seemed transferred from their confused dynamic scramble of life into something just beneath life. Something that was there all the time, but that needed a few glasses of Bridgewater punch to enable it to steal silently forth and show itself as the eternal essence. This old house of Mrs. Ledge had belonged in former times, before Paradise was overbuilt, to a famous West Country family called Camel. Certain portions of it were older and still, and associated with that Richard Atwell, who was buried in St. John's Church, and of whom it is said, "This Atwell did much cost in this church, and gave fair housing that he had builded in town into it." What the grave shades of these old Camels and still older Atwells would have felt if they could have seen the present company, who can tell? It did not even occur to John Crow, as he hugged his knees on that footstool by the fire, or sipped his punch from a glass placed in the polished fender at his side, to wonder what the future denizens of the spacious room, comrades perhaps of the Glastonbury commune, would feel if they could look back upon the existing scene. On John's left, behind his hostess and Mr. Evans, were two high windows, covered now by heavy black curtains that fell from great wooden curtain rods painted red. Silver curtains hung over the doorway, but these were now partly drawn. All around the walls were rough, crudely painted oiled pictures of the ancient recorders of Glastonbury, an office which eventually gave place to that of mayor. These old worthies now looked down upon this motley assembly with an infallible complacence which the passing of time combined with crude and faded oil pigments alone can give. But their presence gave a touch that was required, as did also the molding dark brown wallpaper, a relic from the days of the Camels, and the black frames out of which these burgesses stared, and the big bare mahogany table in the center of the room. As John glanced dreamily into the faces and seemed to look back upon him with a look that said, "When a Glastonbury recorder dies, he passes into a land where men of solid words are permitted to despise the vulgar, without qualm of conscience or rebuke of priest." Thus did old Peter King, whose uncle was John Locke, the philosopher. Thus did Fortescue Turberville. Thus did Edward Phelps, David Gould, Henry Bossequet, Edmund Griffiths, and William Dickinson look down upon John Crow. And it seemed to John as if there was some residual secret of human experience that this particular group of human beings, these living and those dead, could reveal. If only with one mysteriously wide mouth, like the mouth of some great, wise, pontifical salmon from the river Severn, a veritable recorder among fishes, they could utter the word. It would, John felt, be a word that allowed for human imperfection, proceeded from human imperfection, yes, and even exacted human imperfection. It would be a clue that exacted meanness, weakness, pettiness, ordinariness, conceit, vanity, complacency, commonplaceness, mediocrity, conventionality, smugness, hypocrisy, before the full significance of human life could emerge. John wondered to himself for a moment to whom in all this gathering of people he could speak about this inspiration of his, this revelation as to the value of inconsistency, complacency, weakness, dullness, silliness, conceit, which he now derived from the contemplation of Motherleg's guests, both living and dead. And he decided that the only one who would understand him would be Mad Bet. I must get over to her in a minute, he thought. She won't be able to stand Cousin Dave's discourse much longer. How her eyes do stare at me. I must go over and tell her what I've just thought before I forget it. Damn! It's gone. What was it? Could it have been that laziness, self-satisfaction, self-deception, stupidity even, are necessary if life is to be grasped in its essence? That sounds quite silly. How her eyes do stare at me. He turned his own eyes appealingly, to those old recorders, each one of whom had been collected for Mrs. Ledge with patient labor by number 2. Recorders of Glastonbury, he thought. It is my destiny to learn the secret of this mystic value of the commonplace from you. No, it can't have been just that. It was damn near it, though. His erratic mind now found itself dallying with the monstrous thought of what it would be like to embrace a woman as old and hideous as Mad Bet. He felt a certain surprise because this thought, so queerly were his nerves adjusted, did not cause him any terrible shrinking. Was that because he was congenitally more attracted to men than women? Is the way I make love to Mary, he thought, a sign that I am all the time half thinking of her as a boy? Evans, he suddenly said aloud, addressing his friend and jerking his stool forward a little so as to see that grotesque Roman profile of the Welshman. Evans, do you think it would be possible to make love to a woman who was... I beg your pardon, Mrs. Legge. I interrupted you, I'm afraid. Mrs. Legge stretched out a small, plump hand and with a gesture as royal as Queen Victoria's herself patted John's shoulder. Aye, what's that, young man? She chuckled amiably in her thick throat. I was asking Mr. Evans, reiterated John shamelessly, whether he thought it was possible to make love to a person who was perfectly hideous. You don't mean here, purred the preposterous lady, tapping her bosom, which resembled Glastonbury Tor, except that in place of the tower it held aloft a big golden brooch, with the tips of her fingers. You mustn't encourage my astrologer to make fun of his old woman in her own house. Mr. Evans's countenance, as he now turned towards John, showed no distaste at being called Mrs. Ledge's astrologer. It was animated by a rush of all the learned and recondite folklore that John's question summed up. There is a profound esoteric doctrine, Crow, he said solemnly, in what you've just remarked. Our old Syrmic poetry is full of references to it. Suridan herself, the Welsh Deremeter, appeared frequently in an unpleasing shape, and in the history of the Grail it is recorded again and again that the Grail messenger was of striking ugliness. Ugliness seems indeed to have been one of the most common disguises of that feminine principle in nature which. But Evans, interrupted John. Wasn't it a folkword that Goethe in Faust made Mephistopheles? Shut, man alive, cried Mother Ledge. Don't ye invocate Mr. Orphanage to me best parlour. Such devils as he be, maybe ones be for liking we when us be frights, but I bain't asking for that there hugs yet a while. What do you think of these naughty lads, chatter Titty, me poor child? And she leaned forward out of her big chair, raising her voice. I can't hear very well, Auntie. Me pains me bad. These gentlemen say that there be men who would cuss at we, shouted Mother Leg, when us hadn't a tooth left in our head. You were always one of for your bit of mischief, Aunt, replied the sick woman with a great effort, fumbling at the rug of her knees with her bony hand. But 'twould be different if. Her voice died away in a moan of pain. The pain took various shapes in Titty Petherton's consciousness according to its intensity. What it resembled now was a round black iron ball of a rusty blood color, covered with spikes. Titty herself was hugging this ball to her bosom. When she pressed it, the hurt from those iron spikes was intolerable, but you couldn't see its bloodliness any more, which was the thing that turned her stomach most. He says no one is going to be allowed to have anything to do theyselves, but that's true, my precious Marrow. Mad Bet's shrill voice from her seat by the mahogany table rang through the room. She had stretched out her long arm and was pointing to John. There was a general hush. It is true, pronounced Dave Spear in a firm, resolute voice. Let my true love speak, cried Mad Bet again. If he says it's true, I'll believe you. But if he says it's a lie, I'll never believe you. What made John answer this interrogation as to whether, in 100 years, or so he worded the question to himself, Glastonbury would be communistic, exactly as he did, was due purely and solely to the idea that it would please Mad Bet. He suspected that Mad Bet might be naturally so hostile to the existing system of society that it would give her immense satisfaction to think of a drastic change. He also, such was his ridiculously weak nature, disliked the idea, after the formidable silence, of hurting the feeling of Dave Spear, who took this matter of communism in such dead earnest. Thus he lifted his head and closed his eyes, met the intense stare of the madwoman, who was waiting for his response as though it were the verdict of heaven, and cried out in a queer, husky voice, as if he really had been seized with the spirit of prophecy, Mr. Spear is right. And we'll leave it at that. I think I got like 10% of what was going on there. I was really paying attention. Anyway, until next time.